Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Bradshaw from the University of Rijeka in Croatia, specifically the Department of Biotechnology. And today I'm going to talk to you a bit about mental illnesses and, in particular, whether or not they originate from our genetics, whether they're something that is, at least in part, built into us. Let's start with the question of what are mental illnesses and why should we study them? Why should we study them? First off, because they're a big deal. There's different ways of assessing how much effect a disease has. One that the World Health Organization uses is that they count up the number of years of normal life that someone loses to a condition. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the person has died, but it means that they are spending time unable to participate in normal everyday life by being employed or studying or otherwise being part of society. And when assessed in this way, the data is a little bit old now, but I think it's still relevant. We can see that for both men and for women, the biggest cause of disability worldwide is, in fact, a mental illness, depression. And two others, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, also feature prominently in the list. In Croatia, where I'm based, this is also the case. Mental illnesses are the third highest reason that people have to retire early due to health issues. And another reason we have to study them is that, frankly, we're not brilliant at treating them. We have a large array of medications, but many of them aren't as effective as we would like. Classic example is depression. If you give 100 patients a classic antidepressant called an SSRI, at first glance, it will look like about 40 to 60 of them will appear to be getting better. The problem is, if you give the same patients a placebo, so just a tablet that you say is medication but isn't, then maybe 20 to 40 of them will also show improvement, meaning that the actual effect of the drug is maybe only to treat 1 in 5 people. As a result, people with depression often have to try several different medications before they find one that works for them. Another way we can look at them is to ask, what are the symptoms? I won't go through this in detail, just for the sake of time. However, we can get a bit of an idea by looking at artwork done by people who have experienced these conditions. In this case, we have images by someone who has suffered from schizophrenia, or several people who suffer from schizophrenia, and they show some of the classic symptoms. Symptoms include hallucinations, seeing or more often hearing things that are not there, but which appear to be completely true to the person, as we see with these rather weird images on the top left of someone whose cat appeared to mutate during a hallucination. Auditory hallucinations, hearing voices or noises, are more common. We can see that in the top right. Beyond that, there are a wide range of other symptoms, including disorganized ability to think and speak and act, negative symptoms which show some depression-like characteristics, difficulty in focusing your thoughts. It's a nasty condition, and it affects somewhere between 1 in every 100 and 1 in every 200 people worldwide. The single most common one, though, is depression. And for this talk, I will generally be talking about major depressive disorder, which is the most extreme form of it. In general, though, someone with depression experiences, well, it's often described as sadness. That doesn't really express it properly. Rather, they feel senses of hopelessness. They are unable to feel joy in things that they would normally do so. They're no longer able to feel excited about things that, again, they normally would be. It's a really nasty condition, and often people will get these episodes of depression, and it will last for several weeks, during which time it has a huge effect on their ability to live. Someone with major depressive disorder, which is generally what I will mean when I refer to depression today, has episodes like this numerous times returning throughout their life. Very much related to depression is the concept of bipolar disorder. People with bipolar disorder also have these episodes of depression, but they also come along with episodes of mania. Mania is in many ways the opposite of depression. It can be, to some extent, an enjoyable experience in that the person feels free and liberated. However, it is also profoundly dangerous because it comes with a lack of inhibitions, a lack of self-control, which can lead to people doing things that they would not normally do, and which puts them potentially at risk. So while it is, I guess, a more enjoyable thing to experience than depression, it is also a very dangerous condition and can be very scary. Those are some of the conditions I'm going to be talking about. Uh, Main question I want to address, though, is to what extent these come from our nature, from our genetics, things that we've inherited from our parents, and to what extent they come from the natural environment around us. And the starting point for studying this is always to look at twins. Now, you probably know this, but just to be clear, there are two types of twin. The first comes when a single fertilized egg separates, and this leads to two human beings growing who are effectively identical to each other in terms of their genetics. They are identical twins. Twins can also come when two fertilized eggs grow simultaneously. This still leads to twins, two siblings born at the same time. However, they are only as similar to each other as any brother or sister would be to each other, any sibling would be to each other. So on average, they share about 50% of their genetic material with each other. Now, people have then addressed this and said, well, if we know that we have twins, some of whom share all their genetics with each other and some share only half, then it will be interesting to compare the two. Because in both cases, we would expect the twins to share a childhood together, share lots of experiences. If we found out that one set of twins was more likely to have a mental illness than the other, then it can't be because of their environment. It can't be because of their upbringing, because both sets of twins should have this, which means that if there is a difference, it must be because of this extra 50% of genetics that they share. Now, there's a couple of big studies done on this, both in Scandinavia. A study in Sweden looked at major depressive disorder in 15,000 pairs of twins, basically everyone born during a certain time period, while a study in Denmark looked at twice that number and schizophrenia. And what they looked at is what's called the diagnostic concordance. And what this means is if one twin has, let's say, depression, what is the chance that their sibling has it as well? And we look at this both for identical and non-identical twins, monozygotic and dizygotic, if we want to use the exact words, but ones that share all of their genetics and are identical, and those that only share about half and so are non-identical. If a non-identical twin has depression, their brother or sister has about a 12% chance of developing it as well. Now, this is higher than we would expect from the general population, but not ridiculously so. On the other hand, if one identical twin has depression, their identical brother or sister has an almost 40% risk of developing major depression too. And this suggests that this additional genetic material they share is giving them a much, much bigger risk of developing depression, which would argue that, yes, at least part of depression is coming from their genes, not all of it. You can be identical to someone with depression and still probably you will not have it yourself. But clearly, genetics are playing a big part. Schizophrenia, far more so. Normally, the average person only has about a 0.5 to 1% chance of having schizophrenia. However, if your non-identical twin has it, your risk is closer to 1 in 3. If your identical twin has it, you are at a very, very high risk of developing schizophrenia yourself. And this argues that genetics plays an enormous role in schizophrenia. Again, still not everything, because you can be identical to someone with schizophrenia and not get it yourself, but it certainly adds a lot to the risk. So we'll now look at the two different aspects of this then. Clearly, genetics play a big role, but not everything. We must have some combination of genetics and the environment, which add together to give us our risk of mental illness. Let's start by addressing some of these environmental risk factors. Now, I'd like to emphasize at this point, these are only risk factors. These are things that give you a slightly higher chance of developing the illness. However, they definitely are not guaranteed to do it. So if there is anything here that applies to you, please do not panic. I'm not telling you that you will develop schizophrenia or that your family member will. These are just things that make you very slightly more likely to. Let's say you're going from a 1 in 200 chance to a 1 in 100 or a 1 in 50 chance. Still will probably be fine. One that is interesting is that if a mother suffers from the flu, influenza, at certain critical points of her pregnancy, it's been shown that her child has a slightly increased risk of developing, in particular, schizophrenia in later life. Um, Probably this isn't directly caused by the flu itself. Probably it's a case that if the mum's immune system becomes very active at a particularly risky point in the baby's development, then it means that something goes ever so slightly wrong, which might cause schizophrenia later. But it certainly seems to be the case that, at least when you look at a large group of people, you will find those whose mothers had the flu at one critical time point in her pregnancies are a bit more likely to get schizophrenia. Similarly, we know from studies in the Netherlands after the Second World War and in China after the Great Leap famine of the 60s that if a mother goes through famine, is starved at certain particular points in her pregnancy, then this again carries to her children a slightly higher risk of developing schizophrenia. Again, at some critical point while the brain's developing, if the mum doesn't have enough food, there's a chance something will slightly go wrong, which might in later life develop schizophrenia. Now, those are quite dramatic, suffering from a virus or famine. There are milder things too. Weirdly, if you are born in late winter, you are very, very, very slightly more likely to develop a wider range of different mental illnesses. The chances here is tiny, but if you look at enough people, you will find out people born in winter, in particular late winter, on average, slightly more likely to have depression, schizophrenia, etc. Tiny effect, certainly interesting. Probably it's not being caused by the winter itself. Maybe what's actually happening is that if a mother is pregnant during a very hot summer, it has a slight effect, but that's speculative. We really don't know for sure what's happening here. We just look at the statistics and see that it does seem to be the case to a very, very small extent. The age of your parents does also have a slight effect as well. Very old fathers are slightly more likely to have children with mental illnesses, as are very young mothers. Probably different things happening here. With the old fathers, more likely that there will be random genetic mutations coming in that get passed on to the child, which might cause or at least increase the risk of mental illness. With young mothers, more likely it's because in at least some cases, people who have children when very young are doing so in stressful environments socially, and this stress might have a slight effect. Again, it's only averages, it's only a slight effect, but if you look at enough people, you can see that it does happen. Very sorry for that. Cannabis. For some reason, I get asked about this a lot by some students. If you smoke cannabis, particularly in early adulthood or late teenage years, you are slightly more likely to develop schizophrenia in particular. The exact reason for this isn't clear. It appears to be certain chemicals in it. It's also true that people with schizophrenia are more likely to smoke both generally and in particular cannabis. So there is a bit of a effect having the opposite direction as well. But if you do the maths, it does look like that smoking cannabis probably does increase your risk of schizophrenia. Trauma. particularly in childhood, can have a increasing risk of developing mental illnesses in later life, particularly depression. Uh, Trauma in adulthood can also trigger, again, depression in particular in some individuals. The type of trauma varies, but certainly being put under this sort of intense emotional pressure does seem to have an effect. Things that have subtler effects, weirdly, if you move countries, particularly at certain ages of your childhood, increased risk of schizophrenia and depression. Very, very small, very, very slight. I wouldn't panic about it, but does seem to be the case. Even living in a big city compared to a small city seems to have an effect. People, this is based mainly on studies from Denmark, who live in big cities are found to have slightly higher risk of several different mental illnesses than who live in small areas. Again, this is probably, along with the moving country thing, more that being in a busy environment or changing to a new place is a kind of mild trauma, kind of stress, and this has some effect. Again, the chances are small. To emphasize, while all of these things do have an effect, none of them is big enough that you need to worry about it on a personal level. Maybe they will increase your risk by a couple of percent, but still, probably you'd be okay. Certainly, I moved to Croatia with my two young children from the UK without worrying that I was going to give them schizophrenia as a result. So, we've talked about a few different things here. How can we sort of sum these all up? Um, well, one way we can do it is we can imagine a sort of chart of ages at which they take effect. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorder classically first manifest sometimes in late teenage years, more often in early 20s. Depression can manifest at any time in adulthood, can also be in children as well, but this is less common. However, for at least some of the effects, uh, they're actually seen far earlier. Um, Having elderly parents, having your mother experience famine or influenza happen before you're even born. So there's a definite time gap between this and the start of the disease. Others, trauma, moving countries, etc., happen much closer to the time during childhood. And some happen around the time of the event itself. So, particularly trauma seeming to trigger depression and use of cannabis. We can also put genetics in as probably something that we have from the beginning. Well, we have it from the beginning, we don't know what its effect is. The general model that we seem to have, sorry, I'll go back a slide. The general model that we seem to have then is that uh, there are various things that give us our risk. If we experience a number of different things during our early development, before we're born, during childhood, then we can be at a higher risk of developing schizophrenia, for example, than we otherwise would have been. But it still requires something else to trigger it in later life. Cannabis potentially can be this, trauma potentially can be this. If you experience these later life risk things without having a risk anyway, probably you'll be fine. If you have the risk factors but nothing traumatic happens to you, probably you'll be fine. The combination of the two, though, seems to be critical. This is a bit of a simplified view, but in general, the idea that we have an inbuilt risk and then other things maybe push us into the illness later seems to hold up. So, how then do we identify variation in our genes, mutations, or perhaps just subtle differences between different people that can cause mental illness? Well, broadly speaking, there are two different approaches we can take. Firstly, we can take a family, or at least a group of closely related people, who have some trait, in this case, mental illness, that is common to a lot of them. Secondly, we can take a large group of people, population of a country or a city or an area, and look at the differences between the people in that area with our trait, mental illness in this case, compared to the other members of the population. Let's start with the family approach first, and what we call a linkage study. The best way to describe this is to give a very simplified example. Let's imagine that we have family. It starts off with two individuals, both of whom have one pair of chromosomes. So we have, let's say, a man with a blue chromosome and a red chromosome, and a woman with a green chromosome and a purple chromosome. They have children together, and in each case, the father passes on either the red or the blue chromosome to his offspring, and the mother passes on either the green one or the purple one. Time passes, one of the children has children of their own, some of their chromosomes get passed on, others do not. Now, let's imagine that the original father was then found to be suffering from depression, and this was also then seen in two of his descendants. In this simplified version example, we can quite clearly see that people with the blue chromosome are far more likely to develop depression than any other chromosome here. And this suggests that there is some genetic variation on the blue chromosome that is significantly increasing the risk of suffering from this condition. It's not a guarantee, very much like the environmental risk factors we talked about before, because there's at least one person here who has the blue chromosome and didn't get the disease. However, the effect seems to be pretty large. And this is basically what we do in a linkage study. We look at normally a much larger family, use sort of markers to track genetic material through generations, and see which chromosomes seem to, in general, travel through the family with disease. We can actually do slightly better than this because of a phenomenon called recombination. Recombination happens when two copies of the same chromosome kind of swap genetic material with each other, so that some material that was on one chromosome ends up in another. This is quite normal, it happens often, but as a result, every time someone has kids, there will be some chromosomes where this has occurred. And this means that the picture will be something a bit more like this, where we see sometimes not an entire chromosome passed on, but a sort of hybrid of the two possible chromosomes. An individual who inherits, for example, mostly the green chromosome, but also a little bit of the purple instead. Now, in this new version, we have an additional person with depression now. They inherited mostly the red chromosome from their father, also a little bit of the blue chromosome. And this is very interesting because now we can not only say that it appears that probably the blue chromosome is responsible for the depression, it may well be the case that just this small section of it is responsible. We can then look at this section, figure out which genes are in it, and from that say, okay, we have a list of, 30 genes in this region. One of these may well be causing, or at least increasing, risk of mental illness. So we take this list, we choose from it ones which we think are likely to be involved, ones maybe that are expressed in the brain and involved in its functions, and we can then test them. And we test them in a population. So we find an area, we get individuals who suffer from particular illness or have some particular trait, and we basically genotype our genes of interest in all of these people. We then also look at members of the general population of similar age, similar mix of sexes, etc. Genotype the same genes in them and compare the two to see if there are any variations in this gene that are more common in the people with mental illness than people without. So here we can imagine that there is some variation in it, and of all of the yellow minions here, only 3 have this variation, whereas a lot of the purple minions have it. In this case, we can say that this variant is far more likely to be found in a purple minion, and therefore is highly likely that it in some way plays a part in the purpleness. Obviously, with mental illness, we have the same thing then. If a particular variant is far more common in people with depression, for example, it stands to reason that this gene plays a role in the development of depression. And by using these two different studies, family approach to identify groups of genes that might be involved, and population-based approach to then identify which ones seem to carry risk. We can start to identify genes which potentially are causing mental illness more generally. This is the classic approach. These days, we can also genotype most of the genome of an individual and try and bypass some of these aspects. However, the logic is basically true. Okay, so for the final part of my talk, I want to give an example of a gene discovered using a slight variation of this approach. It's, I guess, quite an old story. That's in 1970, when a boy was admitted to a Scottish jail. This boy had minor mental illness. However, when he was examined, it was discovered that he had what's called a chromosomal translocation. Now, I mentioned earlier the combination when two identical or two copies of the same chromosome, two copies of chromosome 1, for example, can swap genetic material with each other. This is normal. This happens. Much more rarely, two different chromosomes can share genetic material. In this case, the boy's chromosome 1 and chromosome 11 seem to have swapped over their ends, leading to the boy having two hybrid chromosomes, one that was mostly chromosome 1 with a bit of chromosome 11, one that was mostly chromosome 11 with a bit of chromosome 1. His family were investigated, and it was discovered that many people in the family had this mutation, this translocation, but also many members of the family suffered from mental illness. This is data from about 20 years later, so most recent studies were done in I think it's about 2015 maybe, and scientists now have information on 107 members of this family, and 37 of these people have this genetic translocation, this mutation, this swapping over of DNA. Interestingly, 23 of the people with this mutation have either schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression, and none of their relatives do. Some of their relatives have, I don't want to say minor mental illnesses, less severe ones like alcoholism, etc. But these three major mental illnesses uniquely found in individuals with this translocation, very strongly suggesting that whatever's happening as a result of this mutation is giving family members a massive risk of mental illness. And this is interesting, but also slightly unexpected, because people with this translocation actually have pretty much all their DNA. Some of it's in the wrong place, but they haven't lost half a chromosome or anything like that. In fact, there's only one point where genetic material would be lost, and that would be if there was a gene right at the point where the chromosome split in two. If there was, then this would be literally broken in half. Half ends up on one chromosome, half on another. And as a result, they would be lacking this gene. There's a big effort then to try and figure out whether there was a gene there. And indeed, it was found that there was a gene previously unknown that was broken in two by this event. It was given the name disrupted in schizophrenia 1, or DISC1 for short. And it appears, therefore, that in this family, loss of the DISC1 gene because of this event gives them a massively increased risk of developing a wide array of different mental illnesses, not just schizophrenia, even though it's in the name. Now, this particular mutation, as far as we can tell, only happens in this family in Scotland. However, since then, different variants of DISC1 have been studied in a variety of populations worldwide, and different versions of it give at least some increase of risk to schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, and a variety of other conditions as well. This happens in different populations, different countries, you see different mutations. There's not one mutation that's present everywhere, but generally it seems to be the case that if this gene goes wrong, your chance of developing a mental illness increases dramatically. Interestingly, DISC1 is involved in a number of different processes, which makes sense for schizophrenia. It's known to be involved in the early development of neurons, as well as some additional neuronal development that we get in adulthood, not too far away from when the disease begins. It also generally plays roles in controlling our synapses, the connections between our nerves. So there is certainly a lot of ways we can imagine that DISC-1 could affect mental illness. It seems like a plausible theory that it can, in some way, affect our mental health. One way that people have been studying this is through animal models, generally looking in mice, sometimes in rats, few cases in fruit flies or other creatures. And several different research groups have attempted to either recreate this Scottish mutation in these animals, or they've added in some other risk variant, or in some cases, they've just destroyed the gene entirely in animals. Exact effects vary, but in general, these animals then display behaviors that are a bit like depression. I don't want to say that they are depressed because a mouse is not capable of feeling the array of uh, complex emotions that make up depression. However, they do show behavioral changes similar to it. In particular, they're a lot more anxious, they tend to be hyperactive, and they tend to have lots of changes in how their synapses function. And again, this fits the idea that destroying or altering DISC-1 can have a major effect on our mental health. And this is, I think, quite cool because we started off with two very human conditions, schizophrenia and depression, plus some others like bipolar disorder, which were present in a Scottish family, not this one, but a Scottish family. And from this, we were able to identify a gene. This gene was mutated, possibly mutation of this gene is what's causing the mental illness. We've put this gene now into animal models, and we've managed to recreate aspects of the disease in a different species. So again, this provides strong evidence that DISC-1 is a genetic risk factor for mental illness, only one of them, and only in some people. But it's a good starting point to do future research and try and find out more about the underlying biology of mental illness and maybe one day come up with new ways of treating it. Thank you very much for listening. My work has been supported very much by all the students who've worked in my laboratory, my international collaborators, and my various funding agencies. Thank you very much for paying attention.